My sister was crying on the phone, and something about the way she cried told me the truth before her words ever did. "I need help with the babies," she said. "Their daddy isn't stepping up the way he promised." I didn't ask her anything. I just sat there in my car outside my office, engine still running, and waited for the rest of the sentence to arrive on its own. My name is Laura Hollis. I've been married 12 years to a man named Bramwell Sutton, and for 12 years I carried a weight most people never see. The weight of wanting a child that never came, of doctors using words like unexplained, of a husband who called himself building something while I paid for every brick of the life we shared. I tell you my name now because what happened next deserves a name attached to it. Mine. Pernell didn't say his name. She didn't have to. I've raised that girl half my life, paid her way through things our mother never lived to see her finish, and I know the sound of her voice when she's protecting someone. She protects the people she loves the way I taught her to, quietly, completely, without thinking about who gets hurt standing outside that circle. I hung up and sat in silence, and my mind did something I hadn't let it do in months. It started counting. I counted the Thursday dinners Bramwell missed, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on its own, and suspicious stacked 12 deep. I counted the weekend trips for opportunities that never turned into anything I could see or touch. I counted the $400 that left our joint account in cash withdrawals over the last half year, small enough each time that I never stopped to ask, large enough together that they should have screamed at me the whole time. I counted the way he'd stopped meeting my eyes when I asked how his business trips went. I counted the way his voice had gotten softer with me and busier with his phone. None of it had been a secret. I had simply chosen, for 12 years, to believe the version of my husband that let me keep sleeping at night. If you're watching this right now, tell me what time it is, where you are. Because where I was sitting, it was just past 6 in the evening. And it was the moment I stopped explaining away what I already half knew and let myself actually suspect it. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that clearly. Because crying would have meant I was still surprised, and I wasn't. Not really. Not underneath. I was just finally letting myself look straight at something I'd spent 12 years learning how to look around. I thought about calling Bramwell. I thought about calling Pernell back and asking her to say the name out loud, just so I could hear her fail to do it. Instead, I set my phone down on the passenger seat and sat with my hands on the wheel, letting the last 6 months arrange themselves into a shape I didn't want to name yet, not even to myself. Then, I picked the phone back up. I didn't call my husband. I didn't call my sister. I called my attorney. Not because I knew everything yet, but because I needed to know what my options were before I let myself believe I did. Frederica Boatwright's office smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than I usually let myself drink. And she didn't waste time on comfort before she got to the truth. "You sound like a woman who already knows what she wants," she said, sliding a legal pad toward me. "I want to know what's mine," I said, before anybody else decides to argue about it. She asked me questions for 20 minutes straight. Whose name was on the house? Whose income built the savings? Whose signature guaranteed the loan on Bramwell's business? I answered everyone without hesitating, because I'd been the one signing those papers for over a decade. I just never let myself think about what that meant until a phone call from my sister cracked something open in me. "You built most of this alone," Frederica said, tapping her pen against the pad. "That matters more than people think it does." I told her about the withdrawals. Small ones, spaced out. Never enough at once to trip anything I would have noticed if I hadn't already been looking for reasons to be suspicious. She didn't get excited about it. That surprised me. "Don't build your case on cash withdrawals yet," she said. "Right now, that's a pattern, not proof. If those funds went somewhere they shouldn't have, supporting another household, another woman, anything outside this marriage, that becomes a different conversation. Courts call it dissipation of marital assets. But I'm not going to tell you we have that. I'm going to tell you to start documenting everything from this point forward, quietly. So if it becomes relevant later, we're not scrambling. I appreciated that she didn't hand me a fantasy. I'd had enough fantasy for 12 years. Start moving what's yours to protect, she said. Separate accounts, updated beneficiaries. If there's equity in the house, we document your contribution now, not after somebody else has a chance to argue about it. I signed where she told me to sign. I called the bank while I sat in her office because I didn't trust myself to still have the nerve by the time I got home. My hands didn't shake. That frightened me a little, how steady I'd become in the span of one afternoon, like grief had turned into a second spine holding me up. 12 years, I said out loud, not really to her. And I'm sitting here talking about beneficiaries like it's just paperwork. It is just paperwork, Frederica said, not unkindly. The marriage was the part that mattered. This is just cleanup. I let that sit in my chest a moment before I nodded. She closed the folder in front of her and looked at me the way people look at you when they're about to ask something they already suspect the answer to. Do you want to wait until he's back in town before we file? Some clients prefer to have that conversation face-to-face first. No, I said, and I didn't have to think about it. I don't want a conversation. I want it handled. Then we'll need to serve him while he's away, she said. That's doable, but it has to be done properly or it gives him grounds to slow things down later. Tell me how, I said. Tell me exactly how this gets done, without me having to say a single word to him. Frederica explained how service would work, and I listened the way I used to listen to closing arguments back when I still believed most conflicts got resolved with reason instead of paperwork. He's staying at his own listed address while he's away working, she said. That's still his residence of record. A process server can leave the documents there with someone of suitable age living in the home. And that satisfies service under the law. He doesn't have to be standing in front of us for it to count. I gave her the address, the one that had been his for years, the one I'd mailed things to myself back before I stopped believing there was anything left worth mailing. Frederica didn't ask me anything further about it. She'd stopped asking me things she didn't need answers to. I filed on a Tuesday morning. I remember because the receptionist at the courthouse had on the same shade of red lipstick my mother used to wear, and I found myself staring at her mouth instead of the paperwork in front of me, grounding myself in something small so I wouldn't have to feel the size of what I was doing all at once. The process server called Frederica 2 days later. He'd left the papers with a woman renting a room at the house, someone who barely knew Bramwell beyond passing him in the hallway, who signed for the envelope the way you sign for anything left at a door that isn't yours to question. I don't know what she told him when she handed them over. I only know what Frederica told me, that whoever she was, she'd said something to Bramwell along the lines of just routine, probably insurance stuff. Don't worry about it right now. Words she likely believed herself, having no reason to think it was anything more than paperwork passing through her hands. And Bramwell, a man who had never once in 12 years opened his own mail if he could help it, took her word for it and set the envelope aside without looking again. I sat with that fact longer than I expected to. 12 years of watching him drift through consequences like they belonged to someone else. And here he was doing it one final time, with the one piece of paper that mattered more than anything he'd ignored before it. Frederica and I spent the rest of that week on the accounts. My name came off anything joint that didn't need to stay that way. My name went fully onto what I'd built alone. The house sat in a different category, not something I could simply claim, she reminded me, but something the numbers would speak for clearly enough once anyone bothered to look at who had been making the payments for the last 9 years running. I didn't need to take it. I needed to make sure nobody could pretend I hadn't earned my claim to it. There was no argument. No raised voices. No moment where Bramwell stood in a doorway asking me to explain myself, because he never knew there was anything happening that required an explanation yet. I packed 2 suitcases on a Thursday evening, the kind of packing where you stop halfway through and realize you're choosing between grief and forward motion. And forward motion wins simply because it's the only direction that doesn't hurt to look at. I drove to Charlotte before sunrise, my cousin's porch light still on from the night before, like she'd known somehow I'd need it lit. I sat in her guest room with my suitcases still zipped, and I picked up my phone one last time. I didn't call anyone. I turned it off. For the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody in the world could reach me. I stayed off the grid for 4 days before I let myself turn the phone back on. And even then, I only used it to check the time and the calendar, nothing else. Charlotte in early morning is quiet, in a way Atlanta never let itself be. And I sat on my cousin's back porch most mornings with coffee going cold in my hands, doing something I hadn't done in 12 years, nothing at all. Georgia law gives a marriage 31 days minimum before a divorce can be finalized, even when nobody's fighting over it. Frederica told me that up front, so I wasn't waiting on anything sudden. I was just waiting. The way you wait for a wound to finish closing after the stitches are already in. I'd learn later, piecing it together the way you piece together a season of your life you weren't present for, that Bramwell spent those same weeks the way he'd spent most of the year, moving between Purnell's apartment and whatever version of business he was still calling his time away. The woman who'd accepted those papers on his behalf had handed them to him exactly once, the way Frederica said she would, and Bramwell had done exactly what 12 years of marriage had taught me to expect. He'd glanced at the envelope, seen nothing that looked urgent enough to interrupt him, and set it on a counter somewhere it could wait. He never opened it. I think about that more than I probably should. Not with anger anymore. I'd used up most of my anger by the time I left. But with something closer to disbelief at how much of our marriage had run on exactly that pattern. Things that mattered, set aside for things that felt easier in the moment. A woman who loved him, set aside for a woman who made fewer demands. A wife building a whole life with her own 2 hands, set aside for a man who never once had to ask what it cost to keep that life standing. Purnell was the one who finally told me, months later, what those weeks looked like from the inside. The twins keeping both of them up most nights. Bramwell restless in a way she couldn't name yet, talking about going home soon, like home was still sitting there, waiting on him unchanged. He started packing on a Sunday. I know because Purnell remembered the day clearly. It was the day he told her he needed to talk to me himself, face to face, and tell me about the babies the right way. Like there was still a right way left to tell a wife something like that. He folded his shirt slow, she said, like a man rehearsing a conversation in his head, choosing which words might soften a blow he still believed he had the power to control. He believed he was coming home to a wife who didn't know yet. He believed the hardest conversation of his life was still ahead of him, waiting behind our front door, his to start whenever he finally worked up the nerve. He had no idea the door he was picturing didn't open onto anything anymore. Corvina told me about that afternoon herself, weeks later, her voice still carrying the shake of it even then, like the memory hadn't finished happening inside her yet. Bramwell walked into her kitchen the way he always did after time away, dropping his bag by the door, kissing her cheek, already talking about being hungry before he'd even sat down. He looked lighter than she remembered him looking in years, she said. Sun on his skin. Something loose in his shoulders that she should have questioned and didn't, because a mother sees her son happy and wants to believe it's simple. "Where's Laura?" he asked her, pulling a plate down from the cabinet like he still lived in a house where that question had an easy answer. "She not answering my calls. I figured she'd be here." Corvina said she almost laughed at the question, the casualness of it, like he'd misplaced his wife somewhere between the driveway and the kitchen table. "You mean you haven't talked to her?" Corvina asked him. "Not even once, this whole time?" "Been busy," he said, not looking up from the plate. "You know how it is when I'm working something." Corvina told me she felt something shift in her chest right then. Small and cold. The kind of feeling she'd learned not to ignore in 61 years of living. She set the dish towel down. "Bramwell," she said. "Laura's gone." He laughed. She told me he actually laughed, short and easy. The laugh of a man who thinks he's about to be corrected on some small misunderstanding. "Gone where? She got a trip planned she didn't tell me about?" "No, baby," Corvina said, and her voice had already started changing, the warmth draining out of it word by word. "Divorced. She filed going on 6 weeks ago now. It's already final." He set the plate down on the counter, slow, like his hands had stopped fully belonging to him. "Divorced from what?" he said. "We haven't even talked." "There's nothing to divorce. We're fine." Corvina told me that was the moment she understood he had no idea. Not a flicker of it. Whatever paper he'd been handed weeks ago, wherever it had ended up, he had walked through his whole return home, believing his marriage was exactly where he'd left it. "You didn't get the papers?" she asked him. "Somebody was supposed to have given them to you." "What papers?" he said, and his voice had lost the easiness completely now, gone thin and fast. "Mama, what are you talking about?" Corvina said. She stood there a long moment, torn between the son she'd raised and the daughter-in-law who'd never once given her a reason to doubt her, and something in her settled on the side of truth, the way it always eventually does when a person's spent their whole life choosing honesty over comfort. "Wait," she said, watching his face for the first time, really seeing what she was about to break. "Laura didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" Corvina said. The kitchen went very quiet after she asked him if Laura had told him, quiet in a way that made the refrigerator hum sound loud. "Tell you what?" Bramwell asked again. And this time his voice had an edge in it she hadn't heard from him since he was a boy, caught in a lie too big to talk his way out of. "About the papers," Corvina said. "The divorce papers. Somebody left them with you weeks ago, Bramwell. A woman was supposed to hand them to you directly." He stood there a moment, and Corvina told me she watched something move behind his eyes, some memory dragging itself up from wherever he'd buried it. "There was an envelope," he said slowly. "Weeks back. She said it was routine, insurance paperwork, something like that. I didn't even open it." "It wasn't insurance," Corvina said. "Then what was it?" "It was Laura filing for divorce," Corvina said, and she told me she made herself say it plainly, no softening, because softening it would have only given him room to keep believing something gentler was still possible. "She filed. It went through the waiting period. It's final, Bramwell. Has been for about 2 weeks now." He laughed again, but Corvina said it didn't sound like the laugh from before. It sounded like something breaking trying to disguise itself as a sound of amusement. "Final," he repeated. "You're telling me my marriage is over because I didn't open an envelope." "I'm telling you your marriage was over long before that envelope showed up," Corvina said. "The envelope was just paperwork catching up to something that had already happened." He sat down hard in one of her kitchen chairs, the same chair he'd sat in as a boy doing homework, she said. And for a moment, he looked like that boy again. Small in a way grown men rarely let themselves look in front of their mothers. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "We didn't fight. We didn't even talk about any of this. People don't just end a 12-year marriage without a conversation." "Some people don't need the conversation anymore," Corvina said. "Some people have already had it with themselves. long before they say a word to anybody else. Did she say anything to you? Before she left, did she tell you why? Corvina told me this was the part that cost her the most to answer, because she didn't have anything to hand him that would make it easier. She came to me before she filed, Corvina said. Sat right there at my table. Told me she was leaving. She didn't tell me why, Bramwell. I didn't ask her to explain herself, and she didn't offer it. I just knew, looking at her, that whatever it was already settled in her a long time before that conversation. He put his head down against his hands, and Corvina said she almost reached for him the way she would have when he was small, before she remembered that comfort wasn't going to undo anything sitting between them now. Why? He said, quiet, almost to himself. Why would she do this without even talking to me first? Corvina looked at her son a long moment before she answered. I don't know why, baby, she said. All I know is she had it handled and finished weeks before you ever walked back through that door. Purnell told me this part herself, much later, in a conversation neither of us enjoyed having, but both of us needed. Bramwell called her that same evening, she said, his voice already unrecognizable, stripped down to something raw and fast. Did you know? He asked her, no greeting first. About the divorce? Did you know before I did? Purnell said she almost lied. She told me that honestly, without flinching, the way she's told me most hard things since. She said lying would have been easier, and for 1 second she reached for it out of habit. I knew, she said instead. How long? Since before she filed, Purnell said. Bramwell. She knew about us before any of this happened. She knew about the twins before she ever walked into a courthouse. How? He said. How does a person just know something like that without anybody telling her? I asked her that myself once, Purnell said. She told me it wasn't one thing. Said she'd been sitting on withdrawals from the joint account for months, small enough she kept talking herself out of asking about them. Said she finally pulled the statements one night and matched the dates against every one of your trips. Once she had that, she said, it wasn't hard to find the account they were tied to. She didn't need anybody to tell her anything, Bramwell. She built it herself, piece by piece, before I ever called her crying. Purnell said the silence on his end went on so long she thought the call had dropped. She knew, he finally repeated, like the words needed saying twice to become real. The whole time. Every conversation I had with her these last 2 months, every time she asked how my trip was, she already knew. Purnell told me she felt something crack open in her chest, hearing him say it out loud, the full weight of it landing on her for the first time too. That Laura hadn't stumbled into this discovery. Laura had walked through weeks of an ordinary-sounding marriage already knowing it was over. Already building her exit in silence while everyone around her assumed things were simply going on as they always had. She never said a word to me, Bramwell said. Not one word. She just let me keep living like nothing happened. She didn't owe you a conversation, Purnell said. And she told me the words came out sharper than she meant them, sharper than she'd allowed herself to be with him in months. Not after what we did. He didn't answer that. Purnell said she could hear him breathing on the other end, unsteady, like a man trying to find solid footing on ground that kept shifting under him. I thought I was the one who was going to have to tell her, he said. I had it all planned out. I was going to sit her down, explain everything, ask her to understand. I thought I still had that choice. You didn't, Purnell said. You haven't had that choice in a long time. You just didn't know it yet. He went quiet again, and when he spoke next, his voice had changed, gone careful in a way that made Purnell's stomach turn before he even finished the question. Does Mama know? He asked. about the twins. Does she know yet? Purnell told me. She opened her mouth to answer and found nothing there. She didn't say anything at all. Corvina told me she was still in the kitchen when Bramwell came back that night, later than she expected, his face carrying a look she didn't have a name for yet. "You look like a man who's been hit twice," she said, watching him sit back down in that same chair. "I called Purnell," he said. "I needed to understand how long she knew." "And?" "She knew before I did," he said. "Before I even said anything to her about it, Laura already knew everything." Corvina told me she felt her stomach tighten at the word everything. That small word, doing more work than he probably realized. "Everything about what, Bramwell?" He didn't answer right away. She said she watched him turn something over in his mind, testing whether he was ready to say it, and losing that argument with himself before he even opened his mouth. "There's something I have to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, before any of this." Corvina said she went very still, bracing herself without knowing yet what she was bracing for. "Bramwell, whatever it is, just say it plainly. I'm too old for you to walk me into it slow." "Purnell and I," he started, and then stopped, and started again. "It happened a while back. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. And it kept happening, and I didn't know how to stop it or how to tell anybody." Corvina told me she sat with that a moment, absorbing the shape of a second betrayal arriving less than an hour after the first one had barely finished landing. "Purnell?" she repeated. "Laura's sister?" "Yes, that's who you've been with. That's what all this was." He nodded, and Corvina said something in his face had already started collapsing, like a man watching a wall. He built himself finally give out under its own weight. "There's more," he said, and his voice had gone smaller now, almost childlike. "She had 2 babies, a few months back. Twins." Corvina told me the room went completely silent then, so silent she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could hear the refrigerator humming the same as it had earlier that day, when her whole world had still made a kind of sense. She said she hadn't meant to say his name the way she said it next, not sharp, not cruel, just hollowed all the way through. "Bramwell." "I know," he said. "I know how it sounds." "You don't know how it sounds," Corvina said. "You knew you had children, and you sat across from me not 20 minutes ago and let me think the worst thing in this house tonight was a divorce." He didn't answer that. Corvina said he just sat there, and she realized in that silence that nobody had forced this confession out of him. He had walked himself right into it, tried to explain one betrayal and torn open a second one in the process, because he had never once in his whole life learned how to carry a hard truth without eventually setting it down in front of the wrong person at the wrong moment. Corvina looked at her son a long time before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whose are they, Bramwell?" she asked, though something in her face told him she already knew the answer, waiting on the other side of that question. "I never told Bramwell how much of his business ran through me. I don't think I ever fully let myself add it up either, not until Frederica laid it out on paper during a settlement meeting, line by line, like a ledger of everything I'd quietly been carrying without calling it by its name. My credit had guaranteed the equipment lease 2 years back, when his own application came back denied, and he'd asked me, almost embarrassed, if I'd co-sign just this once. My name sat on the line of credit that kept his supply orders moving during slow seasons. My income, steady and provable in a way his fluctuating contracts never were, had been the quiet reason a bank looked at his business and decided it was worth the risk. He used to call it his company. I let him. I understood, even then, that a man needs to feel like something belongs to him outright, And I'd already given up my own version of that feeling somewhere around year 7, when I stopped expecting fairness and started just managing what was in front of me. Frederica explained it to me plainly during that meeting, the same steady voice she'd used with me from the very beginning. Once the divorce is final, we notify the lender that you're withdrawing as guarantor. They won't cut anything off overnight. Banks don't work that fast. But they'll open a formal review, and he'll be given a window to either qualify on his own or find someone else to stand behind him. I signed what she put in front of me. I didn't feel triumphant doing it. I felt like I was finally setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long my shoulders had forgotten what it felt like to be empty. Purnell told me later how it landed on his end, weeks after that letter went out, because by then she was one of the only people still speaking to him regularly. He'd gone into his office that morning, she said, still reeling from the twins being out in the open now, still trying to hold together whatever pieces of his life hadn't yet come apart. He'd gotten a letter earlier that month, she said, something about a guarantor review, but he'd assumed there'd be time to sort it, the way there always seemed to be time for things he didn't want to look at closely. Then his phone rang. Purnell said she was there when he answered it, said she watched his face change in real time the way faces do when a conversation turns into something the person on the other end never saw coming. "This is Bramwell," he said. And then a long pause, and then, "You're telling me the 90 days are already up?" Purnell said she couldn't hear the other end of the call, only Bramwell's voice, going tighter with every question he asked. "I didn't know it was that close," he said. "I thought I had more time to find somebody else. Nobody explained it would move this fast." Whoever was on the other end kept talking, and Bramwell went quiet in a way Purnell said unsettled her more than any amount of shouting would have. "Say that again," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Say that again slower." Purnell told me she didn't know yet what he was hearing. She only knew, watching him, that whatever it was the kind of news that doesn't let a person sit back down easy once they've heard it. Frederica called me into her office on a Tuesday, no urgency in her voice on the phone, which by then I'd learned to read as its own kind of warning. She was a woman who saved her calm for the moments that needed it most. "We finished tracing the transfers," she said, sliding a folder across the desk toward me. "I told you back at the start we wouldn't build anything on assumption. This isn't assumption anymore." I opened it slow. Months of bank statements highlighted in neat yellow lines, each one a small withdrawal I remembered noticing and forcing myself to look past. 400 here, 600 there. Never enough alone to demand an explanation, always adding up to something else entirely once you stopped looking at them one at a time. "These match deposits into an account under Purnell Hollis's name," Frederica said. "Consistent timing, consistent amounts, going back over a year. We can't call that proven yet. That's still for a judge to weigh. But it's exactly the kind of pattern courts take seriously when someone argues dissipation of marital funds. Money spent outside the marriage, without your knowledge or consent during a time he had every reason to know the marriage was in trouble. I intend to argue it hard." I didn't feel triumphant hearing it laid out. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired. The particular tiredness of finally being handed something solid to stand on for a suspicion you'd already privately carried for months. "This strengthens our position on the settlement," Frederica said. "I'll be building the case for a larger share of the marital estate around it, to offset what left the marriage without your consent. It's not guaranteed, but it's a real argument now, not a guess." I signed where she needed me to sign, and I let her handle the rest, because by then I'd learned the difference between carrying a fight and simply allowing the facts to carry it for me. Purnell told me later how it reached Bramwell, because his attorney had no choice but to walk him through exactly what Frederica's documentation contained before responding to it. "They've got a case building," he told her, calling her that same evening, his voice thin in a way she said she'd never heard from him before. "Every transfer, every date. My lawyer said it's going back over a year, Purnell." She knew. She had to have known for months and never said a word. Bramwell, I thought I was careful, he said. I thought as long as it wasn't a lot at once, nobody would ever… He stopped himself. Purnell said she could hear him breathing hard on the other end, like a man who'd just realized the ground he'd been standing on had been mapped out and measured long before he ever noticed it moving. She wasn't just ahead of the divorce, he said, quieter now. She was ahead of everything. The whole time I thought I was getting away with something, she was just letting me use up enough rope to hang myself with it. Purnell said she didn't have anything to offer him after that. There wasn't a version of comfort left that fit what he was hearing. My lawyer says, this could shift the settlement hard against me, he said. Purnell, I don't know what's left after this. I genuinely don't know what's going to be left once they finish arguing over what I owe. Purnell told me the days after the settlement news were quiet ones between them, quieter than she expected from a man who just watched his financial ground disappear from under him. She said she thought, for a while, that quiet meant he was finally settling into what was left. She was wrong about that, she told me, though she didn't blame herself for not seeing it coming. He showed up at her apartment on a Saturday, she said, dressed like he'd made himself look presentable for something, which should have told her more than it did at the time. I went to see a lawyer, he told her, standing in her doorway before she'd even fully opened it. Not Frederica. Somebody else. Somebody who does this kind of thing. What kind of thing? Purnell asked, though she said some part of her already suspected. Legitimation, he said. For the twins. Making it official. Making me their legal father on paper, with all the rights that come with it. Purnell said she stood there a moment, not sure whether what she was feeling was hope or dread. The two so tangled together she couldn't separate one from the other. You want to do that now, she said. After everything. Especially after everything, he said. Purnell, I lost the marriage. I lost the business. Near enough. I'm not walking away from them too. Whatever's left of me, whatever I've still got standing, I want it standing for them. She told me she wanted to believe him completely in that moment. She said some part of her did, but another part of her, the part that had watched him drift through consequence after consequence, without ever once reaching for something on purpose, couldn't help but wonder what exactly he was reaching for now. His children, or just something, anything, that still had his name attached to it in a world that had stripped nearly everything else away. It's not about proving something to Laura, he said, like he'd heard the question she hadn't asked yet. This isn't about her at all anymore. Isn't it? Purnell said quietly. He looked at her a long moment, and she said something in his face shifted, like he was working out the answer to that question for himself in real time, right there in her doorway. Maybe it started as that, he admitted. Maybe some part of me wanted to have something left that nobody could take a paper and sign away. But it's not just that anymore. I want to be their father. Not just biologically. I want my name on something that says I showed up. Purnell told me she'd expected, once he finally said all of that out loud, that relief would come easily to her. A man wanting to claim his children should have felt like good news, plain and simple, the kind of thing she could have said yes to without hesitation. I want to file this week, he said. I need you to sign off on it, Purnell. I need you on my side for this one. She didn't answer right away. She told me she stood there in her own doorway, looking at the father of her children, asking for the one thing she'd spent months quietly deciding she wasn't ready to hand him, and she felt something harden in her chest instead of soften. I need to think about that, she said. He blinked at her, like the words hadn't landed the way he expected them to. Think about it, he repeated. Purnell, they're my children too. I know whose children they are, she said. That's exactly why I need to think about it. Purnell told me all of this the way you tell someone a story that belongs to another life entirely. Carefully, at a distance, like she understood by then that whatever happened next between her and Bramwell had nothing left to do with me. Purnell told me she almost didn't call Frederica at all. She said it felt strange, reaching out to my attorney for something that had nothing to do with me anymore. But she didn't know who else to trust with a question that mattered this much. And she'd watched Frederica handle everything else in this mess without a single wasted word. "I'm not asking you to represent me," Purnell told her, sitting in her car outside Frederica's office before she'd even worked up the nerve to go in. "I just need to understand what my rights actually are. Nobody's ever explained any of this to me plainly." Frederica gave her 20 minutes between other clients, Purnell said, and didn't charge her for it. "I want to be clear before we start," Frederica told her. "I represent Laura. I can't advise you on your case, and nothing I tell you today makes me your attorney. But the law is the law, and I can explain how it generally works so you're not walking into this blind." "That's all I need," Purnell said. "Right now, you hold all the leverage," Frederica told her. "He has no legal standing. None. Biological fatherhood isn't the same as legal fatherhood, not for children born outside a marriage. If he wants rights, he has to petition for them, and you're allowed to contest that petition. You're allowed to ask a judge to look at everything before anything gets handed to him easily. Even after everything he's already lost," Purnell said. "Even now. Especially now," Frederica said. "Desperation doesn't automatically make someone a safe bet as a father. A judge will want to see stability. You get to raise that." Purnell said she sat with that for a long time after she left, turning it over, and by the time Bramwell called that evening asking if she'd made a decision, she already knew what she was going to say. "I've thought about it," she told him. "And I'm not signing off easy, Bramwell. If you want to be legally recognized as their father, you're going to have to go through the process the right way. A judge is going to hear both sides. I'm not just handing you standing because you asked for it at the right moment." His voice changed fast. She said, the careful gentleness from before curdling into something sharper. "I thought you understood why I'm doing this." "I understand why you say you're doing this," Purnell said. "But you lost a marriage over things you didn't handle honestly for over a year. You lost a business because you weren't careful with money that wasn't fully yours to move. I'm not about to hand you my children's futures on the same trust that's already failed twice." "They're my children too," he said again. And Purnell told me she could hear the desperation cracking through now, no longer trying to sound composed. "I know whose they are," she said. "That's exactly why I'm not going to make this easy. If you want to be their father in every way that matters, prove it somewhere that isn't a phone call, Bramwell. Prove it in front of someone whose job is to actually look at whether you can be trusted with that." "So that's it," he said. "You're going to fight me on this." "I'm going to protect them," Purnell said. "If that looks like fighting you, then yes." He started to say something else, she told me, his voice rising in a way that made her tighten her grip on the phone, but she didn't let him finish. "This isn't getting decided between us tonight," she said. "It's getting decided in front of a judge, the way it should have been from the start." She hung up before he could answer. The call came from a number I hadn't saved, and I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit before something told me to answer. "Laura, it's Corvina's neighbor. She collapsed in her yard about 20 minutes ago. They took her to Grady. I didn't know who else to call that she'd actually want there. I didn't think about it. I didn't weigh whether I still had a right to show up somewhere as Corvina's family. I just got in my car. I hadn't been back in that city in months, hadn't set foot anywhere near the life I'd built and left. But the drive came back to me like my hands remembered it better than I did. I sat in the hospital parking lot a moment before going in, steadying myself for a room I knew might not be empty. It wasn't. Pernell was already there when I walked into the waiting area, sitting stiff in one of those chairs that never let anybody sit comfortably. And she looked up when the doors opened, and I watched her face do several things at once before it settled on something careful. Laura. How is she? I asked, because that mattered more right then than anything sitting unresolved between us. Stable, they're saying. They're running tests. It might have been her heart. Might have been the heat. They don't know yet. Pernell's voice wavered, slightly on the last part. I'm glad you came. I didn't answer that. I took a seat 2 chairs down from her, close enough to be present for Corvina, far enough to keep the distance I still needed between us. We sat in silence a long while. I watched the doors doctors kept walking through without stopping for us, watched the clock on the wall move slower than any clock had a right to move. Laura, Pernell said, eventually, her voice smaller than I remembered it. I know this isn't the time. I know that. But I don't know when there's ever going to be a time. And I don't want to let this room pass without saying something. I kept my eyes on the doors. I think about it every day, she said. What I did. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't understand what it cost you. I need you to know I never stopped loving you as my sister, even when I was doing something that proved I didn't act like it. I let that sit in the air a moment before I spoke. I believe that you believe that, I said, quiet, even. But love that lets itself do that kind of damage isn't the kind I know how to trust again. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm not asking you to trust me today, she said. I just needed you to hear it. A doctor came through the doors then, asking for family of Corvina Sutton, and I stood before Pernell did, because some part of me still moved like Corvina's family first, and everything else second. I got the update. Stable, resting, likely home in a day or two. I turned back toward the waiting room, toward Pernell still sitting there, watching me with something like hope she didn't have the right to wear yet. I stopped by her chair on my way out, just long enough to say the only thing I had room for. Take care of your children, Pernell. That's the only apology I need to see. I walked out before she could answer. Pernell called me a few weeks after that hospital waiting room, and I almost didn't pick up, still unsure what room I was willing to let her back into. But she wasn't calling for herself that time. The hearing's set, she told me, for the legitimation petition. Judge wants both sides in front of her next month. How's he doing? I asked, and I meant it more clinically than warmly, the way you ask about weather in a place you no longer live. Not good, Pernell said. The business is gone, Laura. Not struggling. Gone. He let the lease lapse. Couldn't make the numbers work without the credit backing he used to have. He's renting a room from a co-worker now. A room, not an apartment. I sat with that a moment. I want to say I felt something sharp, satisfaction or grief, but mostly I just felt the flatness of hearing about a life that used to be tangled with mine, from a distance so far it barely registered as real anymore. I drove out to see Corvina that Sunday, the way I did most weeks now. She had the coffee already going when I let myself in, 2 cups set out like she'd been expecting me before I'd even called to say I was coming. He was here Thursday, she said, sliding a cup across the table. She didn't wait for me to ask. Sat right there where you're sitting. I looked down at the chair under me, and something in my chest tightened before I could stop it. Didn't say much at first, Corvina said. Just held his cup like it was the only warm thing left in his life. I let him sit with it a while before I said anything. "Did you talk to him?" "A little," she said. "Enough to tell him I love him. Enough to tell him loving him doesn't mean I've forgotten what he did to get here. I'm not going back to pretending, Laura. Not for him. Not for anybody." "I understand that better than most people could," I told her. And she reached over and put her hand over mine on the table. Quick. The way she'd started doing lately. Like she needed the contact more than the words. "He didn't talk about the hearing," she said. "Didn't talk about the twins, or the business, or any of it. Just sat there a long while. Then he looked up at me and said something I haven't been able to shake since." "What did he say?" Corvina's eyes went somewhere distant, like she was back in that kitchen hearing it fresh. He said, "I keep thinking the affair was the mistake, but it wasn't just that. I thought Laura would still be there no matter what I did. I thought the house would still be mine. I thought the business was mine outright. I built my whole life assuming things I never once tested." I didn't say anything right away. Corvina didn't either. "I didn't respond to it," she finally said. "Some truths don't need a mother's comfort attached to them. They just need saying, once, out loud, to someone who won't flinch hearing them." "Did he say anything after that?" "No," she said. "He just sat there a long while longer. Then he left." I looked down at my coffee, gone cold in my hands the way it always seemed to lately. And I didn't ask her anything else. I bought the house in Charlotte on a Friday, nearly a year to the week since I'd first driven into this city with 2 suitcases and a phone I couldn't bring myself to turn back on for days. It's smaller than the house I left. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect these stories to end with something bigger, something that makes all the loss feel evened out on a scale. It isn't bigger. It's just mine. Every wall of it. Every payment on it carrying only my name and nobody else's assumptions about what that name was supposed to mean. I planted something in the backyard the first week I moved in. Nothing that mattered much. Just a reason to have my hands in soil that belonged to me outright. I think some part of me needed to build something small and watch it grow on its own timeline. After 12 years of building things I never got to watch. Fully bloom before somebody else's choices cut them down. Corvina calls me most Sundays now. Not every Sunday, and never for long, but enough that I've started leaving that hour open without even deciding to. She tells me about her garden, about a knee that's giving her trouble, about nothing important at all. And I've come to understand that the nothing important is the whole point. She chose to keep loving me without needing me to be anything to her son anymore. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain to anyone what that's meant to me. A woman who could have simply let me go along with her son's mistakes, choosing instead to hold on to the truth even when it cost her something to hold it. I don't know everything that happened to Bramwell after that hearing. I know enough. I know Purnell still calls sometimes, and I still answer, though I keep the door only cracked, not thrown open, because some doors are safer left that way for good. I know Corvina still loves her son the complicated way mothers do, distance and devotion both true at once, and I've stopped needing to understand exactly how she holds both. I built a life here that has nothing to prove to anyone who isn't in it. I go to work. I come home. I sit on my own back porch some evenings with coffee gone cold in my hands, the same way I used to in those first quiet days at my cousin's place. Except now the stillness doesn't feel like waiting for something. It just feels like mine. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I regret not confronting him, not making him sit across from me and answer for what he did before I ever signed anything. I understand why they ask. I understand the story they think I'm supposed to want. But I never needed him to answer for anything in front of me. I needed to be somewhere he couldn't reach anymore, somewhere built entirely out of my own hands, where his choices simply stopped being able to touch what I was building next. I didn't leave to punish him. I left because I'd already built somewhere he was never going to find me.